Hello and welcome to this special episode. One of the biggest threats that the international community faces, both in the security sector and in the private industrial sector, is the threat of cyber attacks, not just on government installation, but on businesses. And the intelligence agencies across the world are seized of the problem, but they have taken different steps. And to examine what needs to be done further, we will be looking into those issues in the show, particularly as Mr. Modi ends his very successful trip to the United States, where one of the highlights of his trip was a very successful visit to the Silicon Valley. Many of the Silicon czars see India as perhaps the largest IT market in the next 3-4 years in the world.
As Prime Minister Narendra Modi embarked upon his second high-profile visit to the United States, this time for the 70th anniversary of the United Nations, he made a big pitch for the expansion of the United Nations Security Council and a bigger role for India, including a permanent seat.
The two countries should address and resolve the causes of tension and take all possible measures.
While the Pakistani Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif continued his usual rant on Kashmir, Modi engaged with the America that matters. Looking beyond just the White House, he was hosted by top 40-odd CEOs of Fortune 500 companies in New York. And then, of course, his trip to the Silicon Valley, where he met international technology giants Mark Zuckerberg, Tim Cook, and Indian-origin tech top guns Satya Nadella, Sundar Pichai, and Shantanu Narayan, among others. But why was Silicon Valley toasting India? Because India is projected to be the biggest market for IT users in the world over the next few years. And while Indian IT users growing exponentially augurs well on the one hand, there is a hidden Trojan horse in all this, and that is the underlying threat of cyber attacks. Even as cyber wars and attacks have become a reality across the globe, India's cybersecurity preparedness leaves a lot to be desired. Is India really capable of meeting the challenges in the cyber domain in real time? Lack of a clear and comprehensive cybersecurity policy could be India's major weakness.
Clearly, cybersecurity and the cyber threats that countries, businesses, and individual internet users are now facing is a very big challenge for the international community. And to look at various aspects connected with cyber threats, we have an eminent panel here in Bangalore. We have Mr. Michael Chertoff, former Homeland Security Secretary in the US and a man who's made the United States the fortress that it is after 9/11, and also head of the Chertoff Group. Sir David Omand, who was earlier the head of GCHQ, Cheltenham, a top-notch intelligence agency in the UK, and now visiting professor at the War Studies Department, King's College London. And we have Mr. Vikram Sood on my right, formerly the head of India's external intelligence agency, R&AW, and now with the ORF Foundation in Delhi, and an eminent columnist. And above all else, we have Tobby Simon, who's put the whole team together for his Cyber 360 initiative under the Synergia Foundation. The first question to you, Mr. Chertoff. Mr. Chertoff, sir, the first point I wish to raise is the directive of President Obama, which basically calls for offensive action and not just defensive action, as was the case in the past against cyber attacks. And it has been argued that this heightens the fear of an increasing militarization of the internet. Is that true?
Well, actually, I think what the administration has done is looked at a whole spectrum of responses to various kinds of cyber attacks. Some of them are defensive, raising the standards that the private sector applies in protecting itself against cyber attacks. We face the possibility, obviously, of theft of intellectual property or theft of national security secrets. And there the president has talked about the possibility of economic sanctions or the possibility of indicting people who commit crimes. And we actually had some indictments a few months ago. Now, actually taking direct offensive action, I think, is a last resort. But we do have a cyber command, and I think there's a general recognition that if the United States were attacked as an act of war, if someone, for example, carried out a destructive attack, that the United States would reserve the right to use all of its tools in order to defend itself.
Mr. Sood, sir, What has been your experience in terms of the level of concern in the government of external threats, particularly in terms of cyber security threats? I remember a couple of years ago, the Home Secretary was on record to say that most of India's official websites had been hacked, and the finger was pointing at China.
It's true that there is a growing awareness in New Delhi about the possibility of more and more such attacks taking place. In fact, this morning I read that there was an attack on two Indian websites from Pakistan, they say, and in retaliation, the Indians wiped out 8 of theirs. I don't know whether that's true or not, but that's how the game is being played now. And our concern about the webs or the internet being used for cyber warfare is twofold. One is from within. We have elements like this Mujahideen group. You had that Shami Witness, that Twitter account, who was linked with the ISIS, and coming from abroad. The Lashkar-e-Taiba, for instance, has a number of websites that they use. They have their own portals. So do the Taliban. The ISIS has very sleek programs, very well organized, very topical, should I say. So and now we're facing the threat that you don't have to go to any conclave to be indoctrinated. You can sit in front of your TV and get indoctrinated. And how do you catch that man? And what is the level of surveillance that you want to carry out?
The Islamic State particularly has been rather active in using social media. So David, did you pick up enough chatter to warn you that there was a kind of a cyber or an intelligence problem that was going to crop up? Do you have the capacity to handle the increasing number of intelligence and problems that will come up because of the large number of internet users? And how do you see the intelligence agencies being one step ahead of those who take this route of cyber crimes?
Our nations are becoming increasingly dependent on the internet. Our businesses are dependent on the internet. Our society is becoming dependent on the internet. The criminals were the first to spot the advantages. Cybercrime is rising. Then certain nation states saw this as a way of gathering information and stealing intellectual property. Now terrorist groups and other non-state groups see the possibility of sabotage. So defending ourselves in cyberspace has become a big priority. GCHQ, the agency which I used to head, is the British government's centre for cyber security. And the reason that's put together with the intelligence mission is because you have to be able to enter cyberspace and to study the people who mean us harm. And what surveilling the cyberspace can do is to detect the signs of the malware, that the corrupted software that is coming through, aimed at our companies, aimed at our governments. Now, no one nation can do this on their own. We've recognized that for a long time. We have to work in cooperation with friends and partners around the world. Otherwise, we will wake up and discover that confidence in the internet is beginning to erode because of the level of crime, because of the sabotage that's being conducted through it. So we have very little time, I think, in which we can act together to try and deal with this problem. But we do need to use intelligence. Just simply putting a barrier around a company, that will get you part of the way. But unless you're actively monitoring what is going on the internet, I'm afraid the bad guys, the offense will dominate over the defense.
Interesting. Toby, 2 quick questions. One is that the dependence on the internet, while Sir David alludes to the fact that because of cyber threat, confidence and dependence on the internet may decrease, but the signs all over are, at least in this country, that there is going to be an increasing number of people resorting to internet usage for all sorts of activities. your personal banking, your personal information, I mean, communication, all sorts of things, businesses, everything. So what's the way forward for India? And secondly, the studies that have been conducted officially in India seem to leave out intellectual inputs that could come from civil society, from experts, from groups that, like yours, which are actually working very hard on creating awareness about internet and cyber security. So there are too many holes right now in the entire cyber doctrine that India has put up. How can that be amended?
Excellent question. So let me come up with the first one, the question about what's the future. We have started a journey, and I don't think there is any way that we can turn back. The big example would be the mobile phones, and that is the biggest vulnerability that we have. So once you are on the mobile, if you're connected, whatever you do, people know. So it's a choice that you have made, and once you've made the choice, there is no way you can retrieve it. The second is, if you look at all the new opportunities that are coming by, especially in terms of smart cities. When you look at the idea of a smart city, it immediately comes with all the IoTs that are connected with it, and that makes going forward even more vulnerable unless you are building security architecture in the beginning. And today what happens is you have products that come out without much checks, and they go into the system, and you have plenty of cases. You have the incidence of Target, and you don't really have to hack a system. You just go through one of the components or parts which are vulnerable, and there is today no methodology by which you can check that.
Lots of interesting points have been brought up. And welcome back. We are looking at the challenges that countries face and how to counter the threat of cyber attacks, both on governmental and industrial and private business organizations, as well as what individuals could be up against. Mr. Chertoff, sir, it is said that the US's policies on cyber security and a more aggressive doctrine that is being adopted could eventually lead to cyber operations, which could eventually lead to a full-scale military conflict. Is that overstating the case?
I think it does somewhat overstate it. Most of what we focus on in the United States is first how to raise the quality of our defense, and then to use non-military, non-lethal means, for example, economic sanctions or civil litigation, trade litigation, against people who steal our intellectual property. But it is part of the doctrine of the U.S. that's been publicly articulated that if another country were to actually attack our infrastructure and kill people or seriously damage property, we would treat that as an act of war, just as we would an act that was based on a bomber dropping a bomb. But hopefully it's not going to come to that, because that would lead to a situation in which there would really be no winner, because the surface area against which an attack can be mounted in the modern internet-based society is so vast that you could have very, very significant consequences.
Mr. Sood, sir, it is said that a kind of broad policy doctrine that was put together by the IDSA, NASSCOM, and DSCI, one of the strong recommendations of that for India was that India needs to have a cyber command for the armed forces. Since you headed an intelligence agency which looked at external intelligence, which clearly would be the one alarm post for the armed forces, do you feel that that is an urgent need, or we need to address other issues?
I think as far as you're looking for external threats, cyber command is a natural corollary, because war is not necessarily going to be only a hot war with guns and munitions. It's might be taking other aspects, and crippling an information system, crippling your banking system, or crippling any of your essential systems is part of war, if carried out by another government. And the more networked we get in the systems, the more vulnerable we become, and the greater the necessity, therefore, to have higher walls.
So, David, what has been your experience in countering terrorism, particularly that gets its momentum through the use of internet?
I think in countering terrorism, the first thing you have to do is start with the right strategic aim. And it's protecting the public. And it's maintaining conditions of normality. Now, the vulnerability of the critical infrastructures we all have mean that that key aim could be really put in jeopardy by terrorist attacks. Now, that puts the pressure, I think, on us to find ways of working with the private sector to improve the protection of our national infrastructure, because it is in private hands. Government has a very important role there in working with the private sector. But let's forget the ordinary user of the internet. Let's forget that we need a culture where people recognize some of the risks that they run on the internet, and we educate people. You're not allowed to just jump in a heavy goods vehicle and drive it, or a motor car. We have processes of licensing and training. We haven't yet evolved that for the internet. So we've got to work at the governmental level, private sector level, but also with the ordinary internet user. In that way, we'll build up a much higher consciousness of the threats we face.
Toby, you talked about, in your conference, about the dark web and cryptocurrency and how we need to really wake up to that. At the same time, the Indian cyber policy that's come in doesn't seem to be sound on a legal framework. There are lots of issues that need to be addressed about cyber crimes and infrastructure protection. What kind of threats to infrastructure are we likely to foresee in the near future? Quickly, bullet points.
I would say just 2 or 3 as a bullet point. One, when you look at from a critical infrastructure perspective, everything that is interconnected or wired is under threat. And how do you build defenses? Because you really do not know what's the depth of it, and so we call it the Trojan horse. There is something inside, and you really don't know your adversary. And unless you are able to, as Sir David said, you have the right intelligence to know who your adversary is, then it becomes a cost arbitrage problem, because you can't keep putting perimeter defenses higher and higher, because it means cost. So the whole idea is basically to first identify what are you protecting. So at the end, you have so many things to protect, but you're going to put the money on something which is your legacy or is your crown jewel. So in any of these debates, what you would look at is what's your crown jewel, and you try to protect that. There are some things which it will be taken off, let it go.
Right. Lots of interesting points, but due to paucity of time, we've got to wrap up. But some important findings that have very clearly come out is that cybersecurity and intelligence goes hand in hand. Cybersecurity is a very major threat that businesses other than governments could face, and you've got to wake up to it, whether you set up a cyber command or you have a 360 approach to the various threats that come to you from web intelligence, human intelligence, signal intelligence, and a whole lot of activity. But quite clearly, those living in a delusionary state that nothing's going to go wrong because your internet's working are probably the first who are going to be hit. Most importantly, threats will continue to come up, and the cyber criminals will do what they can to get past the firewalls that we create. Thank you very much for being with us on the show. I'm personally honored to have so many eminences with me on the panel, and we'll be back next week with another episode. Until then, goodbye.